AOC pointed toward the royal guard across the chamber and smirked. "What's he going to do?" she asked. "Stand still until the world changes?" Reporters laughed. Advisors leaned forward, and for 47 seconds the guard said nothing. But then he took one step forward and delivered a single sentence that flipped the entire room, not with volume and not with anger, just truth. But before we show you exactly how it happened, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Lancaster House wasn't built for this kind of tension. Sure, it had seen its share of diplomatic chess matches over the years, the kind where everyone wore expensive suits and smiled while quietly plotting each other's downfall. Today felt different. The Royal Defence Civic Summit was supposed to be one of those polite affairs where military brass and civilian oversight committees got together to discuss budgets and protocols over lukewarm coffee and stale pastries. Instead, the room buzzed with something sharper. The carved ceilings and gold leaf cornices that usually made visitors feel impressed now seemed to amplify every whisper, every shuffle of papers, every nervous cough. Rows of international observers filled the benches like they were waiting for a show. Defence secretaries from half a dozen countries, NGO leaders with their clipboards and serious expressions, NATO attachés who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, and a handful of carefully selected journalists who kept glancing around like they smelled a story brewing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat near the front, and she looked ready for war. Well, diplomatic war anyway. Her navy suit was crisp. Her notepad was a battlefield of highlighted sections and sticky tabs. And her eyes had that focused intensity she got when she knew the cameras were rolling. She'd already stirred things up earlier that morning, questioning whether military spending models from the Cold War made any sense in an age where wars were fought with keyboards as much as bullets. Her voice carried well in rooms like this. It always had. But across the chamber, near the far wall where the afternoon sun caught the edge of a Union Jack, stood something that didn't seem to belong in a room full of talkers. A royal guard, just standing there, perfectly still. Red coat immaculate, black bearskin hat, casting a shadow over his face, white gloves at his sides like he was carved from stone. No nameplate, no microphone, no chair waiting for him at any of the tables. According to the program, he was a ceremonial representative from the Grenadier Guards, listed without a speaking slot. No agenda item, just there. He'd been standing for over an hour by that point and hadn't moved so much as an inch. Not a blink, not a shift in weight, nothing. Several attendees had made quiet jokes about it. One young American staffer had muttered near the coffee station, "Is he here to scare the chairs into attention?" A few reporters had tried to get closer shots, but palace security kept gently steering them away. The whole thing felt strange. This wasn't Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. This was a policy summit. What was the point of having a human statue in the corner? The agenda had been moving along at the usual diplomatic pace. A South Korean ambassador had droned on about dual enlistment models. A French defence liaison had offered some dry commentary about regional task forces, and everyone was settling into that familiar rhythm of polite boredom that marked these international gatherings. Then the moderator, a polished British civil servant with one of those smooth Oxford accents that made everything sound important, called the next speaker. The floor now recognises Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez for remarks and inquiry. She adjusted her microphone and sat up straighter, like a pitcher winding up for a fast ball. The moment everyone had been waiting for was about to begin. Across the room, the guard didn't move. Didn't even seem to notice. Just the red of his coat against those dark wood panels, as still as a painting. And for just a second, the room held its breath. AOC started the way she always did, with that practiced blend of courtesy and edge that had made her famous. "Thank you, Mr. Moderator," she said, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's an honour to be here among such dedicated minds." A few polite chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind you hear at these things when people aren't sure if they're supposed to laugh or not. "I came here today," she continued, her voice warming up like an engine, with a genuine desire to understand the deeper meanings behind tradition, to ask why we preserve what we do, and more importantly, whether those traditions still serve the people they were designed to protect. She let that hang in the air for a beat, and you could practically see the reporters perking up. This was starting to sound like the AOC they knew, the one who asked uncomfortable questions and didn't particularly care whose feelings got hurt in the process. Then she did what everyone knew she was going to do. She turned her attention to the far end of the room. "To that point," she said, and her voice had that sharp edge now, "I'd like to direct a question to the gentleman in red." Every head in the place swiveled toward the royal guard. He might as well have been a statue for all the reaction he gave. "I'm sorry," AOC added with a laugh that sounded more calculated than genuine. "Should I call you Corporal Silence, or is Historical Exhibit A more appropriate?" That got some real laughs, mostly from the younger staffers, and a few of the international delegates who clearly enjoyed watching American directness collide with British formality. A French guy actually tried to hide a smirk behind his fist. One of AOC's own aides was already typing on his phone, probably drafting the tweet that would make this moment go viral within the hour. The energy in the room shifted toward her like she was a magnet, everyone sensing they were about to witness one of those moments that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. But AOC wasn't done. She was just getting warmed up, and you could see it in the way she shifted forward in her chair, the way her grip loosened on her pen. This was her element. Congressman Fielder from Wisconsin told me yesterday that this summit would be full of symbolism. I didn't realize we were importing it from 1812. More laughter, a little more nervous this time. The British officials in the room had gone very still, the way people do when they're not sure if they should be offended or not. "Let me ask the question plainly," AOC said, tapping her pen against the table in a steady rhythm that somehow made everything feel more tense. "What does a man who does not speak, does not move, and does not engage contribute to a conversation about civil military progress, about protection, about accountability?" She gestured toward him now, palm open like she was presenting evidence to a jury. "Does standing still in red mean standing for anything at all?" That one landed like a punch. The moderator glanced down at his notes, clearly wondering if this was going off the rails. Reporters were scribbling faster now, phones coming out to record. Even some of the British officials, who had been maintaining that polite diplomatic poker face, were starting to shift in their seats. AOC wasn't finished. She never was when she had momentum. Because if posture is participation, then perhaps we should all be taught to stare blankly and hope tradition handles the hard questions. Another wave of murmurs swept the room. Camera lenses whirred. Someone near the back coughed uncomfortably. She crossed her arms and smiled, not smugly exactly, but like someone who already knew how the headline was going to read. No offense intended, of course, but it wasn't really a question she'd asked. It was an attack, dressed up in diplomatic language and delivered with surgical precision. The room turned back to the guard, waiting for something, anything, a reaction, a response, maybe just a flicker of annoyance. Nothing. He stood there in that perfect military posture, gloved hands against his uniform's seams, boots aligned like they'd been measured with a ruler. His bare skin cast that shadow across his brow. But you could still see his eyes, steady and focused straight ahead. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe visibly. He certainly didn't respond. The silence stretched out, and it started to feel heavy. AOC let it build for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Well," she asked, her voice carrying that tone teachers use when they're waiting for a student to answer a question they know the student can't answer. "Or is silence your final answer?" Still nothing. And that's when something interesting started to happen. What should have felt like AOC's moment of triumph began to feel like something else entirely. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It had weight to it, like the guard's stillness was somehow pushing back against her words without him having to say anything at all. It wasn't defiance exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something harder to define, something that made the room start to lean forward instead of sitting back and enjoying the show. For the first time since she'd started talking, AOC's pen stopped tapping. The silence played right into her hands at first. Here was this perfect symbol of everything she'd been talking about, a mute representative of outdated pageantry, standing in a room where real problems needed real solutions. She leaned back in her chair slightly, one eyebrow raised in that expression that said, "Well, that's exactly what I expected." But silence has a funny way of changing when it goes on too long. Seconds ticked by, then more seconds. The guard didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give any sign that he'd even heard her. His posture was still perfect, not arrogant or confrontational, just composed, like someone who had been exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The stillness started to feel different, heavier, more intentional. Reporters stopped typing. A few aides looked down at their phones, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention they'd been giving the spectacle. The laughter from a few moments before seemed like it had happened in a different room. AOC cleared her throat lightly. "Well, I suppose that confirms it," she said. And there was still confidence in her voice, but maybe just a little less than before. If the uniform doesn't speak, maybe the institution behind it has nothing to say either. She was trying to regain control of the narrative, to turn the guard's silence back into proof of her point, but something had shifted in the room's energy. Her voice had dropped just slightly, just enough for people to notice. The British moderator shifted in his seat, clearly feeling the need to say something. "The guard has the right to decline comment," he offered, his tone carefully neutral. The ceremonial delegation was invited in an observational capacity. But even he sounded uncertain now, like he wasn't sure what the right protocol was for this situation. Because the room didn't want an answer anymore. Not really. They wanted to understand what they were looking at. A German defense official leaned over to whisper something to his interpreter, both of them glancing at the guard like they were trying to solve a puzzle. An older man in a pinstriped suit, medals barely visible under his lapel, nodded slightly to himself, as if recognizing something familiar. Behind him, a younger NATO attaché was frowning, clearly uncomfortable with watching what looked like public humiliation of a service member. The divide in the room was becoming obvious. The politicians and staffers were enjoying the show, but the actual military people were starting to look uneasy. You could almost see them thinking, "There's something we're missing here." AOC leaned forward again, her voice sharper now, more urgent. "This isn't theatre," she said. "This is a summit about real-world problems, human trafficking, cybersecurity, civil unrest. If your role in that is to look good in a painting, say so. At least then we'll know we've officially given up on relevance." The camera caught her perfectly, articulate and passionate, making her point with the kind of clarity that usually ended arguments. But the lens drifted. It found the guard and stayed there, because somehow, without doing anything, without saying a word, he had become the center of the room. The weight of his silence had shifted from absence to presence, from emptiness to something that felt deliberate and powerful. It wasn't that he couldn't answer AOC's challenge. It was that he chose not to, at least not yet. And in a room full of people who were trained to react, to posture, to perform for cameras and constituencies, that kind of restraint was starting to say more than any soundbite could. The moderator looked down at his notes again, then up at the guard, then seemed to make a decision. "Lance Corporal," he said quietly, "if you wish to answer, the floor is yours." The room went completely still, not quiet, still. Even AOC didn't speak. And slowly, with no urgency or hesitation, like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the royal guard stepped forward. His boots made contact with the stone floor just once, a sound that wasn't loud but somehow echoed through the chamber like punctuation, deliberate, measured, like time itself had decided to pay attention. He moved from his position near the wall, that tall bearskin hat casting a long shadow down the centre aisle as he walked. The red of his uniform caught the afternoon light, streaming through the high windows, glowing briefly before settling back into that deep, serious crimson. He stopped at the edge of the speaking area, close enough to the moderator's microphone that everyone could hear him, but not so close that it looked like grandstanding, just present. Just there. The room watched like it was holding its collective breath, waiting for something they couldn't quite name. And then, for the first time that day, he spoke. "Yeo. Lance Corporal Alastair Quinn," he said, his voice low and steady, with that unmistakable British accent that somehow made everything sound more serious. "Grenadier Guards." No introduction beyond that. No thank you for the opportunity. No apology for the wait. Just his name and unit, delivered like facts. He turned his head slowly, just enough to look directly at AOC. Not with anger or hostility, not with any kind of defensive posture, just focused attention, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "I was invited to stand here today," he said, his voice unhurried, each word chosen carefully. For what I've done, not what I say. That line landed quietly, but it landed hard. AOC opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out. Quinn continued, and there was something in his tone now, not urgency exactly, but purpose. Like a man who had been asked a question he'd been thinking about for a long time. 3 years ago, in Helmand Province, I was tasked with maintaining perimeter silence while a search team extracted civilians from a compromised farmhouse. We were 10 men, no aerial cover, no margin for error. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady and direct. During that operation, a single radio transmission or a single wrong movement could have triggered an ambush. I didn't speak. I didn't twitch. I stood where I was told and held the line. He paused. Not for effect, but to let the weight of what he was saying settle into the room. 23 people walked out alive, 4 of them children. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't empty space waiting to be filled. This was the kind of quiet that comes when people are processing something important, something real. My role wasn't to shout orders, Quinn said, his voice still calm, still measured. It was to keep a promise. Someone near the back of the chamber let out a small breath, and you could almost hear the gears turning in their head. Helmand, civilian extraction, 2021. There had been a story buried in some MOD citation that only military circles had paid attention to. A perimeter operation that had gone perfectly because everyone had done exactly what they were supposed to do. The older man with the medals sat up straighter, recognition dawning on his face. He leaned to the person beside him and whispered urgently, "That's the Kandahar operation. I remember reading about it." The German official was pulling out his phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen, probably searching for the after-action report. Suddenly, half the room was seeing Quinn differently, not as a ceremonial figure, but as someone who had been tested under fire and passed. AOC shifted in her seat. The confidence was still there in her posture, but something behind her eyes had changed, like she was recalculating. Quinn wasn't finished. "You asked what standing still in red means," he said, not with anger or defensiveness, but like he was explaining something important to someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "For me, it means knowing when movement helps and when it endangers." He let that sit for a moment. No theatrics, no folder full of documents, no video clips. Just memory and the quiet resolve of someone who had lived through the weight of that memory. A few of the British military advisors in the room had stopped taking notes. They were listening now, not as analysts trying to capture talking points, but as people who understood what Quinn was talking about, who had stood posts of their own. "Not everything loud is leadership," he said simply. "And not everything silent is weak." Then he stepped back to his position and said nothing more. The room sat with that for a moment, absorbing it. AOC leaned forward again, and you could see her trying to regain the momentum she'd had before, her voice sharp with urgency and that familiar edge. "No one's doubting your service, Lance Corporal," she said, and there was respect in her tone, but also determination. "But this summit isn't about Helmand, it's about now. It's about systems, about visibility, about speaking up when the stakes are high. I respect tradition, but not when it turns into theatre." A few people nodded. It was a good point, delivered with the kind of passion that had made her famous. She'd found her footing again. But Quinn didn't move. He didn't bristle or get defensive. He didn't look around the room for support or validation. He just looked at her, steady and calm, like someone who had one more thing to say and was waiting for the right moment to say it. When he spoke again, it was so quietly that the room had to lean in to hear him, not because the volume was low, but because the weight of what he was about to say demanded attention. "Congresswoman, yeah," he said, "you once praised those who serve in silence, just not when they're standing right in front of you." The chamber stopped, not paused, stopped. There was no gasp. No dramatic intake of breath, no sudden burst of noise, just that impossible crystalline quiet that happens when everyone in a room realizes they've just witnessed something significant. AOC's lips parted, but no words came. Across the room, an aide froze with her fingers halfway to her keyboard. A French press delegate looked up slowly from his notebook, his pen suspended in mid-air. 2 rows back, an American advisor blinked, leaned toward his colleague and muttered something too quiet for anyone else to catch. And in the silence that followed, you could almost see the connection clicking into place for everyone in the room. It started with the younger staffers, the ones who lived on social media and remembered every viral moment. Their faces changed first, that look people get when they realise they've been caught in their own contradiction. Then it spread to the older attendees, the ones who had been around long enough to recognise the shape of political irony when they saw it. It wasn't just the power of Quinn's words, it was the truth behind them, a perfect, undeniable truth. A year earlier, maybe a little more, AOC had gone viral at a fundraiser in the Bronx. She'd been talking about a former Marine who worked as a janitor at a local school, and she'd called him the definition of dignity. A man who never sought credit, who showed up every day and didn't need applause to know his worth. She'd praised his silence, called it noble, said his quiet was a form of leadership. The clip had been shared thousands of times. It had been quoted in profiles, used in campaign videos. People had loved it because it felt authentic, because it honoured the kind of everyday heroism that usually goes unnoticed. And now, here she was, mocking those exact same values, only because they happened to be dressed in red and standing on British stone instead of pushing a mop in a Bronx elementary school. The irony settled over the room like fog rolling in. Quinn didn't elaborate. He didn't pull out his phone to show the clip, didn't cite the date or quote her exact words. He didn't have to. He simply stood there, still and quiet, with the calm authority of someone who had chosen his moment perfectly. AOC looked down at her notepad, and for just a second she seemed smaller somehow, less certain. The moderator cleared his throat gently. Let the record reflect that the remark has been made and stands as part of the formal inquiry. No one moved to speak after that, because there was nothing to add. Quinn took a single step back to his original position and resumed his ceremonial stance. But this time the silence wasn't empty. It was complete. AOC tried to catch her rhythm again. You had to give her credit for that. She was too experienced, too tough to just fold up and quit. I think we're veering into personal history, she said, her voice tighter now, but still controlled. This summit is about present tools for public protection, not isolated battlefield anecdotes. We're talking about systemic reform, not silent rituals. But even as she spoke, something fundamental had shifted in the room. Her words were still articulate, still passionate, but they didn't land the same way. She was speaking to the room, but Quinn had somehow managed to speak through it. He didn't reply, didn't even look at her. He was back in that perfect ceremonial stance, still and silent, but no longer overlooked, no longer just a curiosity in the corner. A delegate from the UN Humanitarian Security Council, an older woman with iron grey hair and a blue silk scarf, nodded slightly in Quinn's direction, just once. Not acknowledging his uniform or his ceremony, but his discipline, his choice. The moderator cleared his throat again. The panel is advised that the guard's remarks will stand in the record without rebuttal. The inquiry may proceed or be tabled for continuation. Reporters were switching tabs on their laptops, rewriting their leadees. The story had changed. This wasn't about ceremonial spectacle anymore, or even about AOC's challenge to military tradition. It was about a single sentence that had punctured the room's assumptions without a raised voice or a dramatic gesture. Quinn didn't gloat. He didn't glance around for approval or validation. He just stood there, still. AOC turned another page in her notes, but the energy behind the gesture was different now, less commanding, more careful. Her earlier momentum had been built on a simple contrast: youth versus tradition, voice versus silence, change versus pageantry. But now, silence had answered back, not with defiance, not with flash or fury, with truth, and the room had heard it. A British delegate, seated beside the moderator, leaned over and whispered something that only a few people caught. That right there, that's the crown at its best. The moderator gave the slightest nod, then addressed the chamber again, moving on to the next scheduled speaker. But nobody really listened to what came next. Not right away. Their eyes kept drifting back to the guard in red, unarmed and unshaken, uninvited to speak, until the moment required it of him. He hadn't spoken because he wanted to prove a point or win an argument. He'd spoken because the moment had needed him to. And then, like all professionals who understand when to step forward and when to step back, He'd returned to his post. AOC continued with her prepared remarks, but you could hear the difference. Her voice still held confidence. She was too seasoned a politician to crumble completely, but the energy had flattened somehow. She moved through statistics on digital surveillance, quoted from reports on predictive policing, gestured toward graphs and charts projected behind her. But the room was somewhere else. They watched her. Sure, but their attention kept sliding back to Quinn, standing there like he'd been carved from stone, the only change a slight shift in the shadow cast by the afternoon sun as it moved across the summit's high windows. There were no applause lines, no moments where the crowd murmured agreement or disagreement. But everyone in that room understood what had just happened. This hadn't been a debate that someone won and someone lost. It had been something rarer. A moment of realignment, where assumptions got quietly challenged, and everyone had to recalibrate what they thought they knew. One British civilian advisor leaned toward her defense attaché and whispered, "I don't know what just happened, but I feel like we all got reminded of something we'd forgotten." Across the aisle, a younger American aide was quietly pulling up something on her phone. The clip from AOC's Bronx fundraiser, the one where she'd praised the Marine janitor for his silent dignity. She watched it for a moment, then paused it, staring at the screen. The contradiction was right there, impossible to ignore, and it hadn't been shouted or argued or debated into existence. It had simply been revealed, quietly and precisely, by someone who had chosen his words as carefully as he'd chosen his silence. Back at the front, AOC was wrapping up with one of her signature lines. "What matters isn't how long we've held traditions, but how long those traditions continue to serve justice." It was a good line, smart and quotable, but the room heard it differently now, through the lens of what Quinn had just shown them. As her voice faded, no one rushed to fill the space with questions or comments, or the usual diplomatic chatter. Even the journalists trained to pounce on the next viral moment waited. Because in a room full of people who had come expecting speeches and sound bites, it was the silence that had taught them something. One of the royal aides, seated near the back, crossed his arms, glanced toward Quinn, and said quietly to no one in particular, "That's exactly why he's here." It wasn't theatre. It wasn't ceremony for ceremony's sake. It was a lesson in the difference between making noise and making a point. And that lesson, brief as it was, had left its mark on everyone who witnessed it. Have you ever seen someone mocked for staying silent, only to speak at the perfect moment? Do you believe tradition still holds weight in modern institutions? If you believe actions still speak louder than words, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon so you never miss a moment like this. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them now. Our other videos should be popping up right about now. Go ahead and watch one of those next, and I'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.